Emma Rodriguez never imagined that hosting a small study group would change her life forever. At 22, she was a senior at Arizona State University, living in her grandmother's house in Millbrook Commons, while finishing her degree in communications. The house had been her sanctuary since her grandmother passed 2 years earlier, leaving Emma as the sole inheritor of the modest 3-bedroom home in the quiet planned community. Millbrook Commons was the kind of neighborhood where American dreams were supposed to flourish. Built in the early 2000s, it featured neat rows of stucco houses with small front yards, wide sidewalks, perfect for evening walks, and a community center that hosted holiday parties and HOA meetings. The residents were a mix of young families, empty nesters, and a few college students like Emma, who had inherited or purchased their homes. Emma worked part-time at a local marketing firm, while maintaining a 3.8 gigapascals, determined to graduate debt-free thanks to her grandmother's gift. Her study group met every Thursday evening, 6 students from her senior capstone project. Quietly working around her dining room table, usually wrapping up by 9 p.m., they'd park carefully in her driveway and along the street, always mindful of blocking neighbors' access. The first sign of trouble came on a crisp October evening when Emma opened her door to find Robert Mitchell standing on her porch. At 58, Robert carried himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. As both HOA president and a city councilman, he commanded respect throughout Millbrook Commons. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his polo shirt pressed, and his expression carried the stern disapproval of someone addressing a wayward child. "Miss Rodriguez," he said, consulting a small notebook, "I've received complaints about excessive noise and parking violations coming from your residents on Thursday evenings. The HOA has clear guidelines about disturbing the peace and hosting large gatherings." Emma felt her stomach tighten. She'd been so careful to keep her study group quiet and respectful. "I'm sorry, Mr. Mitchell. We're just studying for our senior project. We keep the volume down and—" "The rules exist for everyone's benefit," Robert interrupted, his tone suggesting the matter was already decided. "I'll need you to discontinue these gatherings, or face fines starting at $50 per violation." What Emma didn't know was that just 3 houses down, Robert's 24-year-old daughter Ashley was already planning her next weekend party. While Emma hosted 6 students with textbooks and laptops, Ashley regularly entertained 30 to 40 guests with music that could be heard 2 blocks away. The difference was simple: Ashley was family, and Emma was not. The injustice of her situation became clear the following Saturday night when Emma was awakened at 11 p.m. by pounding bass music and raucous laughter. Looking out her bedroom window, she could see Ashley's backyard packed with people, music, speakers set up on the patio, and cars parked haphazardly throughout the cul-de-sac. Emma grabbed her phone and began recording, documenting the noise level and the obvious violations of the same rules she'd been warned about just days earlier. Sunday morning brought another knock at Emma's door. This time, Robert's expression was harder, his politeness strained. "Miss Rodriguez, I've received reports that you were seen photographing private property last night. The HOA takes privacy violations very seriously." "I was documenting noise violations," Emma replied, her voice stronger than she felt. "The same type of gathering you told me I couldn't have, except mine was 6 people studying quietly." Robert's face darkened. "Young lady, I won't tolerate this kind of insubordination. You'll receive a formal warning in writing, and any further disruptions will result in immediate fines." As Robert walked away, Emma noticed Mrs. Chen watching from her garden next door. The 73-year-old retired teacher had lived in Millbrook Commons since it was built, and her expression showed the weariness of someone who had watched this pattern before. "Honey," Mrs. Chen called softly after Robert's car disappeared around the corner, "you should know you're not the first young person he's targeted. Come have some tea when you have time." That afternoon, sitting in Mrs. Chen's immaculate living room, Emma learned the full scope of Robert Mitchell's selective enforcement. Over the past 3 years, he had driven out 2 other young homeowners through escalating fines and harassment, always finding technical violations while overlooking similar or worse behavior from his friends and family. "Ashley's parties have been going on for 2 years, Mrs. Chen explained, her voice carrying the frustration of countless sleepless nights. "We've complained, but Robert always has an excuse. Young people need to socialize, he says, or it's just occasional celebration." Meanwhile, he fined the Johnsons $300 because their teenage son had friends over for a graduation party that ended at 9 p.m. Emma felt a familiar fire building in her chest, the same feeling she'd had in high school when she'd organized protests against unfair cafeteria pricing. Her communications major had taught her about media strategy and audience engagement, but more importantly, it had shown her how powerful authentic storytelling could be when fighting injustice. The following Thursday, Emma made a decision. She would continue her study group, but this time she would document everything. She set up a small camera in her living room, not to spy on her guests, but to prove how quiet and respectful their gatherings actually were. She also began keeping detailed records, arrival times, departure times, noise levels measured on a phone app, and photos of their careful parking. When the expected knock came Friday morning, Emma was ready. Robert stood at her door with a printed violation notice and a satisfaction that barely concealed his pleasure in wielding authority. $50 fine for hosting an unauthorized gathering, he announced, holding out the official HOA letterhead. Payment is due within 10 days, or will begin lien proceedings. Mr. Mitchell, Emma said calmly, I'd like to file a complaint about the party at 425 Maple Street last Saturday. According to HOA Bylaws Section 4.2, any gathering exceeding noise ordinances after 10 p.m. constitutes a violation subject to the same $50 fine. For the first time, Robert's composure cracked slightly. That was a family celebration. Completely different situation. The bylaws don't mention exceptions for family celebrations, Emma replied, pulling out her printed copy of the HOA rules. Section 4.2 states that any gathering creating noise audible beyond the property line after 10 p.m. is subject to fines. I have recordings and witness statements. Robert's face flushed red. Don't quote rules at me, young lady. I've been running this community since before you moved in. You'll pay the fine or face the consequences. As he stormed away, Emma realized she was no longer dealing with reasonable authority. She was facing someone who saw rules as weapons to be used against people he didn't like while protecting those he favored. That weekend, Emma created her first TikTok video. Using the skills she'd learned in her digital media classes, she crafted a simple comparison: her quiet study group versus Ashley's loud parties, with timestamps, noise measurements, and the identical HOA rule being selectively enforced. She titled it "When HOA Rules Only Apply to Some People," and posted it Sunday evening. By Monday morning, the video had 50,000 views and hundreds of comments, from people sharing similar experiences with unfair HOA enforcement. The engagement was organic. People recognized the fundamental injustice and connected with Emma's calm, factual presentation of the double standard. Robert's response was swift and harsh. Tuesday brought a hand-delivered letter threatening immediate legal action if Emma didn't remove defamatory content about the HOA. The letter also announced that her study group gatherings were now classified as commercial tutoring services requiring special permits and additional fees. Commercial tutoring? Emma read the letter aloud to her boyfriend Jake as they sat in her living room that evening. We're studying for the same class. Nobody's paying anybody. Jake, a film student with an eye for storytelling, recognized the escalation pattern. He's trying to make this so expensive and complicated that you'll just give up. It's classic intimidation. But Emma had learned something important from her grandmother, who had immigrated from Mexico with nothing and built a successful life through persistence and community support. Abuela always said that bullies count on good people staying quiet. Maybe it's time to stop being quiet. Emma's second video focused on education rather than accusation. She walked viewers through HOA bylaws, explaining how selective enforcement violated equal protection principles. She showed the actual rules Robert was misapplying and demonstrated how residents could research their own rights. The video's tone was informative and empowering rather than angry, and it resonated with homeowners across the country who felt powerless against their own HOAs. This time, the response reached beyond social media. Local news picked up the story, and Emma found herself being interviewed about HOA accountability. She spoke carefully, focusing on the principle of fair enforcement rather than personal attacks on Robert or his family. Every homeowner deserves to know that rules will be applied consistently, she told the reporter. Whether you're the HOA president's daughter or a college student just trying to graduate, the same standards should apply to everyone. Robert's reaction revealed the full extent of his character. Rather than addressing the legitimate concerns about double standards, he doubled down on targeting Emma. A new violation notice arrived claiming her media activities constituted running a business from her home, subject to additional fines and restrictions. But Robert had miscalculated. Emma's videos had attracted attention from David Park, a 31-year-old software engineer, who had recently moved to Millbrook Commons with his wife and 2 young children. David had noticed the selective enforcement too. Ashley's parties had woken his 6-month-old daughter multiple times, but his polite complaints to the HOA had been dismissed with vague promises to look into it. David brought analytical skills and legal research experience to Emma's cause. Together, they discovered that Robert had been systematically violating HOA procedures for years. Board meetings weren't properly noticed, financial records weren't available for inspection, and violation procedures didn't follow the community's own bylaws. "This isn't just about unfair rules," David explained as he and Emma pored over public records at the local library. "This is about a complete breakdown of democratic governance. Robert's been running this HOA like his personal kingdom." Mrs. Chen became their unofficial coordinator, quietly reaching out to neighbors who had been silenced by fear of Robert's retaliation. She organized informal coffee meetings where residents shared their experiences. The young father fined for his children's sidewalk chalk art, while Ashley's friends regularly damaged common area landscaping without consequence. The elderly couple charged for having their grandson's car parked overnight, while Ashley's party guests blocked driveways for hours. Emma's third video took a different approach entirely. Instead of focusing on her own situation, she interviewed neighbors about their experiences with selective enforcement. Mrs. Chen spoke about watching the community's values erode under Robert's leadership. David discussed the financial impact on young families trying to build equity in their homes. An elderly veteran named Frank shared how Robert's arbitrary enforcement reminded him of the authoritarianism he had fought against overseas. The video struck a chord that surprised even Emma. Comments poured in from current and former military members, immigrants who had fled unfair systems, and parents worried about the lessons their children were learning about justice and fairness. The story had transcended HOA drama to become a conversation about fundamental American values of equal treatment and democratic governance. Robert's response revealed his growing desperation. He called an emergency HOA board meeting, attempting to pass new rules specifically targeting Emma's activities. He proposed restrictions on social media defamation, limitations on commercial filming, and requirements for background checks on all household guests. But Robert had forgotten that HOA governance requires proper procedures and member input. David Park had done his homework, and he arrived at the meeting armed with the community zone bylaws, state HOA regulations, and a growing group of concerned neighbors. "Mr. Mitchell," David addressed the board formally, "these proposed rules violate our community's governing documents and state law. More importantly, they're clearly targeted at silencing legitimate criticism rather than addressing genuine community concerns." Mrs. Chen stood up from the audience, her teacher's voice carrying clearly through the community center. "I've lived here for 20 years and I've never seen someone abuse their position like this. Our young neighbors deserve the same respect and fair treatment as everyone else." The meeting that was supposed to silence Emma instead became a forum for community frustration with Robert's leadership. Neighbor after neighbor spoke about selective enforcement, lack of transparency, and fear of retaliation for speaking up. Ashley herself attended, seemingly unaware of how her protected status had damaged community trust. Emma's fourth video documented the meeting and its aftermath. She presented the community's response not as vindication for herself, but as evidence of neighbors coming together to demand fairness. The video's power came from showing ordinary people finding their voices and standing up for democratic principles. The breaking point came 2 weeks later during Ashley's Halloween party. With Emma's documentation efforts now widely known, several neighbors began recording the event as it escalated far beyond previous parties. Cars blocked the street, music violated city noise ordinances, and party guests damaged multiple residents' property while Ashley and her friends laughed off complaints. When Mrs. Chen called the police about the noise, Officer Martinez arrived to find a scene that clearly violated multiple city ordinances. But when he approached Robert Mitchell to discuss the violations, Robert's response revealed the corruption that had been festering for years. "Officer, these are just kids having fun," Robert said dismissively. "Nothing that needs official action." "Sir, it's 1 a.m. on a weeknight, and I can hear the music from 3 blocks away," Officer Martinez replied professionally. "This is clearly a noise violation." "I think you misunderstand who you're talking to," Robert replied, his voice taking on the edge of someone accustomed to deference. I serve on city council, and I have relationships with your department leadership." Officer Martinez's expression hardened. In his 8 years on the force, he had developed a strong distaste for people who tried to use political connections to avoid accountability. "Sir, noise ordinances apply to everyone equally. I'll need to speak with the homeowner about bringing this gathering into compliance." Emma, who had been recording from her front yard with several neighbors, captured the entire exchange. The video showed Robert attempting to use his political position to protect his daughter from the same laws he demanded others follow. The video went viral overnight, shared not just by people frustrated with HOA overreach, but by viewers who recognized the broader pattern of authority figures protecting their own while punishing others for lesser offenses. Comments came from teachers, police officers, military members, and parents, who saw the video as representing everything wrong with selective justice. Local media coverage intensified, with reporters investigating Robert's track record as both HOA president and city councilman. They discovered a pattern of using his positions to benefit his family and friends while aggressively pursuing violations against residents who questioned his authority. The pressure began affecting Robert's day job. Fellow city council members distanced themselves from his controversial HOA leadership, and constituents began questioning whether his personal conduct reflected the values they wanted in local government. Ashley, meanwhile, found herself facing consequences for the first time in years. Her graduate program in public administration required students to maintain community standing, and viral videos of her ignoring noise complaints while her father protected her became problematic for her academic future. Emma's final video in the series wasn't about Robert or Ashley at all. Instead, she interviewed new HOA board candidates who were running on platforms of transparency and equal enforcement. She spoke with neighbors about their vision for community governance and highlighted the positive changes already beginning to take shape. "This was never about parties or personal grudges," Emma explained to the camera, sitting in her grandmother's garden where she'd spent countless hours learning about fairness and persistence. "It was about whether we want to live in a community where rules protect everyone equally, or where authority serves only those with connections." The election results spoke clearly about community values. Robert lost his HOA presidency by a wide margin, with Mrs. Chen winning the position. On a platform of transparent governance and consistent rule enforcement, Linda Walsh, the board member who had found her courage during the controversy, was elected secretary with a mandate to ensure proper procedures and community input. Ashley's parties ended not because of enforcement actions but because her social circle had witnessed the damage that entitled behavior could cause to a community. Several of her friends privately apologized to neighbors for the disruption, and Ashley herself eventually moved to an apartment better suited to her lifestyle. David Park was elected to the HOA board, bringing his analytical skills and commitment to fairness to the community's governance. His first initiative was creating a transparent violation tracking system where all complaints and enforcement actions would be documented and available for community review. Emma's story resonated far beyond Millbrook Commons because it captured something universal about the American experience: the belief that fairness and equal treatment aren't just ideals, but achievable realities when people have the courage to demand them. Her videos had accumulated over 2 million views, but more importantly, they had inspired other communities to examine their own governance and demand accountability from their leaders. Emma received messages from residents across the country who had used her documentation strategies to address similar problems in their own neighborhoods. The most meaningful outcome wasn't viral fame or social media success, it was the transformation of her community. Thursday evening study groups continued without harassment, but now they were joined by a monthly community discussion group, where neighbors could voice concerns and work together on solutions. Mrs. Chen's election as HOA president brought a teacher's approach to leadership, emphasizing education and collaboration over punishment and control. Emma graduated with honors that spring, her senior project focusing on social media's role in grassroots democracy. She had learned that authentic advocacy required patience, documentation, and building genuine community support rather than just calling out problems online. As she prepared to move to Los Angeles for her first job in digital marketing, Emma reflected on how her grandmother's house had taught her about more than just homeownership. It had shown her that democracy works best when ordinary people have the courage to stand up for extraordinary principles like fairness, transparency, and equal treatment under law. The story of Emma Rodriguez and Millbrook Commons became a case study in communication classes about effective advocacy and community organizing. But for the neighbors who lived through it, the real lesson was simpler. When people come together around shared values, they can create the kind of community where everyone belongs and everyone matters. Robert Mitchell eventually resigned from city council after his HOA conduct became a campaign issue in his re-election bid. He moved to a different community where his authoritarian style was less well documented, but his replacement won office on promises of transparent governance and constituent service that applied equally to all residents. Ashley, faced with the real-world consequences of her behavior for the first time, initially struggled with accountability but eventually used the experience as motivation for personal growth. She transferred to a different graduate program focused on conflict resolution, crediting her Millbrook Commons experience with teaching her about the importance of community responsibility. The transformation of Millbrook Commons didn't happen overnight, but it was lasting. New residents were welcomed with information packets explaining community values and governance procedures. The HOA board implemented regular community forums, where concerns could be addressed before they became conflicts. Most importantly, the community developed a culture where standing up for fairness was seen as neighborly duty rather than troublemaking. Emma's documentation strategy became a model for other communities dealing with HOA overreach. Her systematic approach, recording violations, researching bylaws, building neighbor coalitions, and using social media for education rather than just complaints, provided a roadmap for residents who felt powerless against arbitrary authority. Years later, Emma would return to visit Mrs. Chen and see children playing safely in yards where their parents no longer feared arbitrary enforcement. She would drive past Ashley's old house, now home to a young teacher who hosted book clubs without harassment, and feel proud of the role she had played in creating lasting change. The story of Millbrook Commons reminds us that democracy isn't just about big elections and national politics. It's about the daily choices we make to stand up for fairness in our own communities. When young people like Emma refuse to accept that's just how things are, they create space for the kind of neighborhoods where families can thrive and dreams can flourish. Sometimes the most important battles are fought not in courtrooms or voting booths, but in community centers and front yards where ordinary people insist that extraordinary principles like equal justice aren't too much to ask for in the places they call home. #Reflection. Final, add it. Emma's story raises important questions about power, fairness, and community responsibility that extend far beyond HOA disputes. In our own neighborhoods and communities, how often do we witness selective enforcement of rules? How often do we stay silent when we see unfairness, telling ourselves it's not our problem or that we don't want to cause trouble? Emma Rodriguez was just a college student trying to graduate and honor her grandmother's memory by caring for the home she'd inherited. She didn't set out to become a community activist or challenge established authority. But when faced with injustice, she made the choice to document, organize, and advocate for the principle that rules should apply equally to everyone. Her success came not from viral fame or social media metrics, but from building genuine relationships with neighbors and focusing on shared values rather than personal grievances. She showed that effective advocacy requires patience, preparation, and the courage to stand up for what's right, even when it's uncomfortable. The question Emma's story leaves us with is simple but profound. When you see unfairness in your own community, will you speak up? Will you document what's happening? Will you reach out to neighbors who might be experiencing similar treatment? Or will you stay quiet and hope the problem doesn't affect you directly? Democracy works best when ordinary people refuse to accept extraordinary injustice as normal. Emma Rodriguez proved that one person with a smartphone, a strong sense of fairness, and the willingness to build community connections can create lasting change that protects everyone's right to be treated equally under the rules.